Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Derek Snyder, Senior Director for Science Partnerships at the American Psychological Association. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please let us know where you're from by saying hello in the chat. Today's program is the first episode of 2023 of Science Showcase, an APA webinar series on hot topics in psychological science research, presented firsthand by the authors who did the work. Each month, we'll ask recently published researchers to showcase their findings on topics of interest to you. We hope you'll continue to join us as we learn from experts and emerging leaders, explore terrific new models and methods, and discover psychological science that inspires. Before we get started today, I want to share a few quick announcements. First, many thanks to those who submitted questions for today's program. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. You can also ask questions using the Q&A feature on your dashboard, and we'll add them to our list. Also, you may want to adjust your volume when speakers are speaking because of individual differences in broadcast. Also, this program is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive an email with a link to the recording in about 2 weeks. Here at APA Science, we're on a mission to show how behavioral science affects people's lives and how it can be used to improve the world. We celebrate the scientists who work hard every day to move our field forward, and we hope you'll find their stories as fascinating as we do. Today's topic is relationships, loneliness, and life choices. And I'm very pleased today to have two really great presenters in the area, Julianne Holt-Lunstad and Jeff McDonald. We'll talk about Julianne first and give her a chance to share some of her work. Julianne Holt-Lunstad is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University. Additionally, she is the director of the Social Neuroscience Lab and the founding scientific chair for the U.S. Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness and the Foundation for Social Connection. Julianne's research is focused on the long-term health effects of social connection, and her work has been seminal in the recognition of social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. She has also recently begun work that examines how social relationships may be utilized in interventions to potentially reduce risk. We're very thankful to have Dr. Holt-Lunstad here with us today. And without further ado, Julianne, would you mind sharing a bit more about yourself and your work?
Yeah, happy to. So my work, broadly focuses on the protective health effects of being socially connected and the risks associated with isolation and loneliness. And I've taken a very interdisciplinary approach to this. In addition to my research, I've recently been involved in work in how to apply the science, both in practice and community settings, but also potential for involvement at community and societal level kinds of approaches, even potentially policy. I should make a quick disclaimer that while my work certainly applies to practitioners, and I regularly work with clinical psychologists and healthcare providers and physicians, I am not a practitioner myself, but rather my work it potentially informs practice. So thank you. I really appreciate being here today.
That's wonderful. It's great to meet you, Julianne. Our other guest, Jeff McDonald, received his PhD from the University of Waterloo, and he currently is a professor and director of the McDonald Social Psychology Research Laboratory, or MACLab for short, at the University of Toronto. His lab focuses on issues of social connection and disconnection, with the current focus being loneliness. The research in Jeff's lab tends to be student-driven, with one emerging theme of the lab's work being the intersection of singlehood and sexuality. Additionally, Jeff is very well versed in attachment theory and has spent a lot of time working on issues around the intersection of attachment avoidance and intimacy. We're so glad Dr. McDonald could join us. Jeff, would you mind sharing a bit about your work?
Hi, yeah, nice to be here. I'll give you a very brief origin story. My lab has done a lot of research on romantic relationships. We focused on attachment for a long time. We would often cite Julianne's work on health and well-being, and we would tie that to romantic relationships in particular, and kind of unknowingly It got pointed out to us by people like Bella DiPaolo, who are singlehood researchers and advocates, that, essentially what we romantic relationship researchers were doing were saying that single people were unhappy and probably dead because of their social disconnection. And they were speaking up and saying, like, we're not only not dead, we're actually quite happy, a lot of us, right? So that's been the turn that my lab has taken more recently, is taking a look at well-being among single people. And, even if it is the case that the average person in a romantic relationship is happier than the average single person, what that perspective was doing was ignoring a lot of the within group variability, right? Like, just if there's an average difference, that doesn't mean that there's not such a thing as happy single people. So that's what we've gotten really interested in recently, is that variance within single people, and trying to look at who are the happy single people and who are the less happy single people, and what implications does that have for things like health and happiness. So that's kind of where we're at right now. So excited to talk about that today.
Excellent. So I'm going to lead right into some questions. Some of them are my own, and some of them come from our audience members. And feel free to expound as much or as little as you like on each. I'm going to start by asking, why are relationships important?
Well, I guess I can jump in. I'll just speak very, very broadly, and start off by saying that, humans are a social species, much like many other social species. And throughout human history, um, we have needed to rely on others for survival. And so much like, other species, it's adaptive to be part of a group, for evading predators or protection from the elements, um, pooling of resources to obtain food. That throughout human history, we've needed to rely on others for our survival, and this has a number of important functions. And so this has led many to, or at least many neuroscientists to argue that our brains and bodies have adapted to expect social proximity, and that in essence, that the neural default is social, and that our brain and body is performs optimally in conditions where we're not alone, and that it takes more effort and energy to meet the demands of everyday life on our own, and to deal with the potential challenges and threats in our environment completely on our own. So from that standpoint, it simply takes more energy. um, but of course, that in modern times, we are able to meet many of our needs independently, but there is still, that many of these lingering processes, because from birth we need others to meet our needs and our goals often, and so this has continued to be an important part of not only our survival, but health and well-being. But that's a very, very kind of big picture level, and I'll let Jeff jump in, because there's so much more nuance to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question, right? With a lot of moving parts to it, and especially because society is changing so quickly. There's a lot of things that we couldn't do independently even 10 or 20 years ago that technology is stepping in, and we're kind of finding out we're trying to find out what aspects of relationships are really crucial for health and well-being, and what things can we do more independently in a healthy kind of way. And I think one of the questions that's coming up in my corner of the research world is paying attention to, because I completely agree, there's a very strong evolved element to our need for other people, but there's also a very strong cultural value placed on relationships and particular types of relationships. And that's, really is different across cultures. How important is it for you to be married, for example? How important is it for you to be close to your family? And I think some people are pointing out that there are some types of relationships that we've been told, getting into a marriage will make you happy, And people are starting to ask questions about that because, that's a cultural value, and it's a bit of an open question. Is that the type of relationship that you need to satisfy social connection, or is there some other kind? So, I would say in addition to satisfying these biological and evolutionary kinds of things, being a good person in your society means having some types of relationships and not having other types of relationships. So I'd say that's an element of it too.
Those are both fantastic answers to the question, and they lead to so many more questions. So I think I'll follow up by asking, can you distinguish between the importance of relationships in general and loving relationships, and even further along to partnered relationships?
Maybe I'll jump in on that first. First of all, it's going to be very different from individual to individual. But I also think it depends on like what aspect of well-being are you talking about. So one of the things that came out in one of our studies on singlehood that I found really interesting was that single people who have good relationships with their family and have good relationships with their friends tend to be pretty high in well-being. So they're doing pretty well, but that's not related to whether they want a romantic partner or not. The variable that we found that was particularly related to whether people wanted a romantic partner is how happy they were with their sex lives. And so what we've been hypothesizing is that emotional support is relatively replaceable, at least the way that society is set up right now, that you can get emotional support from a partner, but you can also get that from friends or family. But typically, and it doesn't have to be this way, but the normative way that things are set up is the majority of sexual activity happens in partnered relationships. And so what we found is that people who were happier with their sex lives said that they were less interested in a romantic partnership, but the people who weren't happy with their sex lives were saying that they wanted a partnered relationship. And so to me, that's one of the things that you need to ask there is, what part of well-being are you talking about? And different relationships are probably set up to satisfy different parts of people's needs.
So I'll jump in and give another perspective on this because as I mentioned, I come from this perspective of the kind of the health and well-being perspective, as well as somewhat of a biological perspective. And one of the things, since I do interdisciplinary research, is recognizing that, of course, psychology focuses on interpersonal relationships between individuals. But as I've worked across disciplines, recognizing the importance of a variety of types of relationships and also the kinds of social connection that can occur more broadly. And one of the things that we're learning from a health perspective is that a variety of types of relationships are critically important to health and well-being, and that intimate relationships are just one of those. And intimate relationships provide important goals that people have, whether that's physical intimacy or emotional intimacy. But other kinds of relationships can fill other kinds of needs and roles. And so having relationships with friends, having relationships with your coworkers, your neighbors, within close relationships, the kinds of needs and goals that are fulfilled by your romantic partner may be very different than your child or your best friend or your sister. And that there may be importance for relationships that are not very close. So, for instance, there's more and more research suggesting the importance of what are referred to as weak ties. These kinds of acquaintances and relationships that we have with others, whether that's people in your community, just even, the kinds of interactions that you might have as you engage with, the barista or the person when you check out. or the people in your office that you greet every day. And certainly we've seen, even just during the pandemic, of limiting the contact with many of these other kinds of relationships, how that has impacted people. But interestingly, what we see is that not only are relationships important for our health, but there's evidence to suggest that having a diversity of types of relationships is important, because it helps us tap into different kinds of needs, and that no one relationship type may be able to fulfill all of those needs. And then the other area of research that is emerging is recognizing how it might be important to be able to have interactions with people who are different than us. As we've seen with the increasing division and polarization that's occurring, that we need to understand, these in-group, out-group kinds of dynamics, and how we can better connect across differences, to not only improve individual kinds of goals, but community goals and societal goals, because coming together across these differences are often going to be really important for having a socially connected community that can reach some of these community level types of goals.
That's a really great answer that taps into knowledge about lots of different kinds of relationships. In popular culture, we're kind of sold this story that, like, there's one person out there that can meet all of our needs. And what I think you're suggesting is that might not necessarily be true, and that it's important to have a diversity of different types of relationships, both in order to be a social human being, but also to meet various needs that we have with engagement with the world. So, Julianne, I'm going to pose this question to you first, because I think it bears directly on your work. What is the health impact of relationships, and what are some of those risks of loneliness and isolation?
Yeah, we have very strong evidence now, with data, cumulative data across disciplines and across decades, that have shown that being more socially connected is associated with better kinds of health outcomes, and lower or poor social connection associated with worse outcomes. And so let me just kind of share with you a few of these. So, for example, some of my work has focused on looking at I've done a couple of meta-analyses looking at the effects on mortality. And for instance, what we found across global epidemiological data was that people who are more socially connected have a 50% increased odds of survival compared to those who are less socially connected. And this is consistent across age, gender, country of origin, regardless of initial health status. And so this is an independent predictor. Conversely, when we look at indicators of lacking social connection, including loneliness, isolation, and living alone, that is associated with increased risk. So, for instance, loneliness is associated with a 26% increased odds or increased risk for earlier death, isolation 29%, and living alone a 32% increased risk for earlier death. And again, independent of many of the factors that might otherwise account for this, establishing them as independent risk factors for premature mortality. But even since those meta-analyses have been published, other meta-analyses have been published as well, with converging evidence on this. In fact, the American Heart Association recently published a scientific statement, also summarizing this evidence of the cardiovascular risk of isolation and loneliness. but so in addition to some of the cardiovascular risks, there's also risk for other kinds of physical chronic health conditions, including type 2 diabetes. It's also linked to mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety, behavioral kinds of health outcomes, including addiction and suicidality. There's also cognitive health outcomes, including mild cognitive impairment, dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. And so we have very strong evidence of the mortality risks and strong evidence of the cardiovascular effects, with less evidence around some of the other kinds of health outcomes, but that data does suggest a significant impact. And we're learning a lot about and have evidence on some of the pathways that explain how it is that we go from being more or less socially connected and having better or worse health. And so this evidence is in terms of the health impacts are actually quite robust now. Many organizations are now recognizing this. And in fact, I recently served as a subject matter expert to get isolation, loneliness, and social support included in the electronic health record, so that these can start to be assessed within clinical settings.
Jeff, do you have anything to add there?
No. Yeah, not my area of expertise. Interesting for me to hear too, though.
No, but that's very interesting how you say that loneliness and being in relationships, has these broad effects on many different aspects of physiological and cognitive functioning, and that when things start to decline, that being in a lack of relationship can actually exacerbate some of these problems in broad ways that overall can build up to an increased risk of mortality. So how do recent events and technologies play into this? Things like the COVID pandemic, things like the rise of app culture. Do these things have detrimental effects on relationships? Do these things have any effect at all on some of the outcomes that you've been measuring?
I mean, I haven't, I'll say something just very briefly about this, because my lab hasn't looked at the social media, devices and stuff specifically. I know that there's a lot of controversy around this. There's certainly correlational links between social media usage and things like depression. And my understanding is that there's a lot of debate about where the causal effect there is. Is it that social media is causing these kinds of depressive effects, or when someone is feeling upset, do they turn to something like social media as a way to make them feel better? But I also think that, it's important to think of, I think when a lot of these conversations, when we bring up technology, we bring up these social media kinds of things, but I think that there's a broader role for technology in the way that we need to think about this, and that, and reflecting on what Julianne was just saying about the crucial role of social connection and disconnection. I think we need to be careful to make sure that we don't individualize the phenomenon. A lot of what is driving people apart is more societal level kinds of effects. One of them being, for example, technology has displaced a lot of people's jobs, for example, right? And so in that sense, one of the things that I always think about is that, well, why, if we know that social connection doesn't feel good, are people being driven apart? And one of the things is that it's good for business, for example, that labor is going to be mobile. And I think that puts a lot of stress on community, for example. We have a lot more people moving away from their home communities than we used to. So I would just say that, let's broaden out our discussion of technology. And I tend to be sympathetic with the idea that smartphones are more of a signal of something, because there are in Western society, there's these broader shifts towards individual values, and I think part of that is because of the way that we're structuring society, and a lot of that is technologically driven. So I just would want to broaden out the conversation that way.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to recognize that technology is more than social media, and so there are a variety of um, devices, apps, environments. I mean, it really runs the gamut from things like assistive technologies that may help people with disabilities to connect to others that they might not otherwise, to AI environments. There are so many kinds of technologies, but even within social media, um, it's incredibly complex because uh, uh, one of the things that's, I think, a huge challenge is that these are often rapidly changing. And so, one of the things to recognize is that even if we were to say, take something, like a specific social media platform, and try and study it, what the algorithms are constantly changing. And so, what you might be studying today may not apply, a month from now or a year from now, because the algorithms are changing. So one of the things I want to just first off acknowledge is that I want to acknowledge that I'm currently serving on a National Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine committee that is focused on a report on social media, youth, and health. This is an ongoing report, and in fact, some of the meetings where we are gathering evidence and information to inform that report were public meetings, and they have and are publicly available on their website. So for anyone listening who would like to learn more about that, that's a source of information. So certainly my following remarks are not because I'm speaking for myself and not the committee, because we have not yet made any recommendations whatsoever. Speaking as an individual, as me now, one of the things to recognize is also it's really hard to lump very diverse technologies and usages into they're all good or they're all bad. And there's a lot of variability in there, and so understanding what are some of the more helpful uses and what are some of the more harmful uses is going to be really important. One area of research where there has been shown to be some protective or at least some helpful kinds of trends is getting support online among individuals or communities where support is not easily gotten in their local geographic area. This can be people with rare health conditions or people with stigmatized kinds of characteristics, where they are simply just not getting the support they need locally. But of course there may be and there's research looking at potential harms to mental health, as well as loneliness and other kinds of behavioral kinds of health outcomes as well. The one other thing that I want to mention is that much of the researchers that are in this area have often argued that we need to be focused more on not so much the time we spend on on these platforms, but like what we're actually doing and how they're being used. And I think that is important because some uses may be more helpful than others. However, one thing that is becoming apparent is that many of these are designed in a way that that's how they make their money, is the more time we spend on them, and it's an attention economy, and that in essence, as our attention is increasingly online or on devices, we need to be really careful about what that means and the implications for the displacement of that time and attention to perhaps more productive means. And so I don't think we can completely discount that entirely, but in some, it's really complicated. and we need to learn more for sure. But it's not going anywhere either. So we absolutely, I think it's critical for us to understand that, particularly given the fact that so many of our the ways in which we engage socially have shifted so dramatically that we absolutely need to understand the implications.
That's kind of where I was going with that question, that, some circumstances have required us to become more online in terms of our communications. Things like the COVID pandemic, where we went from being social in person to having to communicate through our computers for, a year or two. Other modes of engagement, like dating apps, have taken a lot of the get to know you events that used to happen in parks and bars and restaurants and shifted those to online forums. Do you feel that that has had any effect on the quality of the relationships that are formed or on people's ability to engage socially in person?
So I'll just briefly mention a couple of studies that were done during the pandemic, and it doesn't fully answer your question, and I'm hoping Jeff can jump in on some of the other parts. But I did want to point out a couple of perhaps what I found to be somewhat surprising studies, but certainly led piqued my interest, and that is. There was a large national study of older adults during the pandemic that looked at those that were connecting to others via, and I believe it was, I don't remember which platform it was on, but in essence, this online kind of remote connection to others. And what they found was that the older adults that did not have this kind of connection to the outside world, as they were, very, very strictly restricted, right, from social engagement. Those that were connecting remotely did not fare any better than those that were not. So it did not provide any benefit in terms of their level of well-being, including a couple of mental health outcomes. Interestingly, also, a study I was involved in that looked at 100, I think it was over 100 countries globally. We looked at loneliness across the globe, and I think there were, this was in multiple languages as well. And we asked people to what extent they connected remotely using video chat and other online means. And what was interesting was what we found was that basically, unless they reported that they were very satisfied, all other levels of from mild, satisfied, somewhat satisfied, satisfied, not satisfied, dissatisfied, every other level of satisfaction was actually associated with greater severity than had they not used those technologies at all. So in other words, these remote means of connection actually were associated with reports of greater severity of loneliness than not just a null effect, but worse outcomes. And so I think just these are just a couple findings, and I'm sure we could find other studies where people did benefit from it, right? And so, but my point is that what this signals is that not all means of connection are equal. We should not just simply assume that connecting remotely is equivalent. That there may be variability in terms of how that has an effect, and that we can't just assume that it's better than nothing. And that it could actually be worse. And so it just raises, I think, a level of concern that we need to better understand the circumstances and nuances of when it can be helpful, when it makes no difference, and when it can actually be harmful.
That's super interesting. I guess I would just add a couple of things to that. I mean, one is that I take your point really well, that I think we need to be very specific about who and under what circumstances we're talking about. And I know that in the dating literature, for example, online dating has been a huge boon for sexual minorities, for example, where, it wasn't safe for sexual minorities to connect with each other in traditional ways, and it's much safer now. So I think there's a lot of examples like that where it is a boon to people. But at the same time, I think it's worth remembering that things like Twitter are not public utilities that are designed for the public good. And so in that sense, we shouldn't necessarily be surprised if they're not, uniformly raising people's happiness, because that's not what they're designed to do. They're designed to make money for companies on whatever it is that makes that money for companies. And I think there's a good argument that what Twitter makes money doing is making people angry at a certain level. It's kind of there to make people feel something, but not necessarily to lead people to connect better. I think about this with dating apps all the time, right? Like, if you actually had a dating app that matched you with your perfect person on the first try every time, that company would go out of business because their customer base would be done the first time that they used it, right? So I think it is really important with this social media stuff to remember, we think that we are the customers of social media, but we're the product, and we will be manipulated in whatever way makes these companies money. They're not necessarily looking out for our best interests. So I think that's a really important structural feature of media that needs to be kept in mind in all of this.
That's a really great point, Jeff. I actually wanted to turn to you for my next question, which is about singlehood. And I know that you've commented a lot recently, and I know that you've published some work on how singlehood isn't all bad. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been looking a lot, as I said, off the top, at the predictors of what leads people to be happy with singlehood. So, I mean, it's really early work. This is there's not only been a shift in the research that's relatively recent. I think there's a shift in culture that's relatively recent, where there's an increasing number of people living alone. There's an increasing number of people who are delaying marriage if they get married at all. So, we wanted to take a look at, well, who among these single people are happy? The data so far, I would say, suggests that on average, people in romantic relationships are happier than people who are single. But it's not clear why that is yet overall, because, it could be that getting in a relationship makes you happier. What we've seen is that seems to lead to a temporary bump in happiness, but not necessarily a lasting effect. I think there's probably also an effect where happier people tend to get in relationships. And so I think that that's something that we still need to sort out. But in terms of the variables that predict whether people are happy, one of them, for example, is, do you want a romantic relationship? And I think that this is, in the romantic relationship field, and to a certain extent in culture, I think this is one of the mistakes that we've been making, is that we assume that everybody does. And not everybody does. And certainly even people who eventually want to be in a romantic relationship have periods of their life when other things are a higher focus for them. So, for example, when we asked single people, if you were building your perfect single life, what would your priorities be? A lot of people would guess that sex and dating is at the top of single people's minds. And of the options that we gave them, it was literally at the bottom of the list, that the things that were more important to them were their physical health, their mental health, their relationships with their family. After that were things like, their work life and their friend life and that kind of thing. So yeah, one of them is, how much do you want to be in a romantic relationship? And not surprisingly, people who want something and don't have it tend to be less happy. As I'd said before, relationships with friends, relationships with family, happiness with your sex life is important. Age seems to be something that's important, that in our data, it looks like after about midlife, single people on average start to become happier with being single. We don't think that that's unique to singlehood per se. There was another study by Janina Buehler that was asking the same question about people in romantic relationships. And after midlife, people in romantic relationships also started to get happier about being in a romantic relationship. So, we think that what happens is that by midlife, people kind of know what they want and what's good for them. They stream into the singlehood stream or the relationship stream. And then just in general, as people get older, there's evidence suggesting that we get emotionally healthier. You make peace with your circumstances, you've made the choice that's right for you. And so there is this kind of stereotype of elderly singles being miserable with their lives. And, if anything, our evidence suggests that older singles are happier. We think that there might be an inflection point at something like 75 or 80 when there's, more serious physical needs start to kick in. That's been challenging for us because, as it stands right now, you tend to get a lot fewer participants up there. And so we're not super confident what's going on there, but at least like midlife to retirement, those are not your unhappy singles. If anything, those are the people who have learned what they want to do with their life on average, and are happy with it. So that's kind of like an initial sampler of some of the stuff we found so far.
That's really interesting. I also imagine that as people age, certain aspects of relationships become more important. Things like companionship over sex, and just general warmth versus intense feelings of passion and love. Is that consistent with your data?
We haven't looked at that question specifically. And it's hard to tell. A lot of the data that I've seen on, for example, deprioritizing sexual satisfaction, for example, comes from people in long-term relationships. But what you'll see is that if somebody gets out of a relationship, at age 50 or 60 and then gets into a new one, sex all of a sudden becomes really important to them. So I certainly would not want to say that sex is something that's not important to people as they get older per se. But in some cases, it does get deprioritized. Yeah.
Well, and I'll just add that there may be additional kinds of needs that may be unfulfilled, if someone doesn't have a partner nearby. And that is that as people age, they may require other kinds of more tangible kinds of support. And so one of the concerns that many policymakers have is, as we have this increasing aging population and we have shrinking household size and lower rates of marriage and partnership, and lower rates of individuals having children, is that there are fewer opportunities for informal kinds of support. Someone to, if you're sick, who can make you a meal, to, help you manage your medications, take you to the doctor, all of these kinds of things, that then if you don't have the financial resources, then we no longer have informal supports, and we need to have more formal kinds of programs at kind of an institutional or government level because we can no longer rely on these informal familial types of supports that have traditionally been relied upon.
I would add something to that, because I think this is a real challenge and sort of a discussion that the singlehood literature has needs to have. But I think that the counter argument to a certain extent would be, at the same time, there are institutional barriers to single people accessing some of this stuff that, could be addressed with things like, there's stories where somebody's support and their caregiver is their best friend. It's like, your wife or your husband gets automatic admission to the ER if you have some kind of an emergency, and friends often won't, right? So I think that there are some of these structural barriers. There's also single people talking about, and I take your point, Julian. I think that in a number of single people's cases, they might not have that support around them in the way that somebody with a family or a romantic relationship might have. But some people are building, they'll talk about chosen families, for example, right? So that there are non-governmental solutions to this that just require, first of all, I guess just accepting that there are these single people out there. And I think one of the problems here has been society assuming that, well, these are less worthy people. If they don't have a family or they don't have a romantic partner, we don't need to turn attention to them. And I think that there's just sort of a growing political power among single people who are just saying, no, our lives are valid. And because we haven't chosen to get married doesn't mean that we don't deserve some say in how society is structured, right? So I think there's going to need to be a bit of a back and forth there to recognize, not just the challenges that single people have, but some of the barriers that have been placed in their way institutionally.
Yeah, and I'll just add that that there are structural barriers. There's also stigma associated with that, and but nonetheless, we do need to recognize that in some cases, individuals may have greater need, and particularly because of these barriers. And so we need to, in essence, address those needs and recognize those needs.
Those are all really great points. I wanted to talk about sort of the flip side of forming relationships, which is breaking up from relationships. And breakups can often be quite traumatic, and they can be informed by trauma. Why are breakups so hard?
I'm happy to jump on that one. So I take my perspective on this from an attachment theory perspective. This is something that largely I got from a paper that was written by Angie Leroy a few years ago, looking at the intersection between attachment and physiological responses to breakup. And the way that Angie in her paper puts it is that basically what we do when we're in a romantic relationship, or really any intimate relationship, is we have this kind of hierarchy of people who are there to satisfy our emotional needs, right? And so that's what they call the attachment hierarchy. And in essence, if your romantic partner is the person who's the top of that hierarchy, they're the person that you go to for, emotional needs. If if there's a spot on your back that you can't scratch yourself, if there's just like anything that you need, this is the person that you go to, right? And all of a sudden, that person is gone, right? That what Angie would say is that you then need to sort of psychologically reorganize your hierarchy, right? And Julian can speak to this a lot better than I do, but there's a lot of really powerful physiological substrates underlying that. So one that I've been interested in is the opioid system, for example, that one of the rewards, the physiological indicators of a reward of connection is a release of endogenous opioids. And one way to think about this is that when your attachment figure is taken away like that, you're kind of like a heroin addict who can't get access to their heroin anymore. There's going to be this dysregulation. And the way that I like to think about it is that, the kind of difficulty and pain that you go through as you're going through this kind of a breakup over the long term, there's this kind of, there's a course that it tends to take. There's this initial dysregulation. Then there's a period that you go through of essentially what you're trying to do is get that person back, right? And so this is arguably why you think about that person all the time, why you have that urge to call them. And that feels painful. And what I always tell people when they're going through that kind of a breakup is, I mean, it feels bad to go through that, but in essence, what your brain is trying to retrain you that that person isn't there anymore. Like if you feel bad or upset when you try to think about your ex-partner, you're going to stop thinking about that person because people don't want to feel bad, right? So I think that sometimes when people are going through that kind of a breakup, the temptation is to not let yourself feel that sadness. But if you kind of reframe that as feeling that sadness is what's helping me move to the next stage, which is to let go of that person, to stop looking for somebody who's not there anymore. And then that's when, maybe as you're going through the breakup, you feel like, oh, I'm not interested in other people. And then there's that one magic day when you start noticing people again, right? Like from this perspective, that's you starting to successfully reorganize the attachment hierarchy in a way that opens up space to reach out to somebody else. So, I mean, I guess the way that I would answer that question of sort of, why does it feel so bad? Is because it's actually a healthy process. I think if you accept the idea that feeling bad is helpful for you and just let those bad, and not saying it's easy, it's not easy, but if you let yourself do that, that's kind of how people successfully go through that grieving process. Because at the end of the day, and I think that's exactly how Angie LaVoy would describe it, it's a grieving process.
So I'll jump in and take a maybe a slightly different take on that question. And just because, oftentimes we think of breakups as romantic kinds of relationships. But I actually, a few years ago, did a study where we looked at why people don't end ambivalent friendships. And so, first off, I should just kind of mention a little bit about what ambivalent even means. So that is, in essence, these relationships that are characterized by a mix of both positive and negative aspects. So it's in essence the people that you love but can also drive you crazy. It's the friend that is that you spend love spending time with, but can also be really competitive, or someone that you know is can be really great in some circumstances and then really unreliable or insensitive in other circumstances. And so it's these as some people might refer to them as frenemies. Um, and so in my research, we looked at ambivalence in a variety of kinds of relationships, and we can think about why some relationships may be harder to end. And so, for instance, relationships with family, coworkers, it might be that there are certain kinds of barriers, whether that's, family, it might be more of a cultural barrier of obligation to keep those kinds of relationships with coworkers or neighbors. It's not that easy to just quit your job or move to another neighborhood, and so you kind of have to maintain those relationships. But when it's a friend that's presumably a voluntary relationship, why do we continue to maintain these relationships? Because our research showed that not only were people had significant numbers of ambivalent relationships within their social networks, but that they were maintained often long term. And so we asked people, like, why do you maintain these relationships? What's interesting is we suspected that there might be these kinds of external barriers. And indeed there were, so I don't want to discount them, but most of the highest percentage of people also noted internal kinds of factors that were contributing to why they maintained these relationships, including things like that they had invested a lot in the relationship already. They'd had a long history with them and felt like they didn't want to be viewed as someone who gave up on relationships. There were reports of people who maintained these relationships because of the positive aspects, and kind of learned to put up with some of the negative aspects. and many other kinds of uh, uh, other kinds of internal responses. But to bring it back to what Jeff was talking about, uh, some of these may be related to the fact of, that idea of there's this internal desire to maintain relationships that may be a bit more um, primal. And I would often get asked questions when I was doing that line of research of is it better to have a bad relationship than no relationship? And um, both carry risks, and that when we experience loneliness, it's often defined as the discrepancy between one's desired level of connection and one's actual level of connection, which I think also ties back to what Jeff was talking about in terms of romantic relationships, and often that discrepancy between what we desire and what we actually have. And that's the defining feature of loneliness is that distressing feeling that we feel when there's that discrepancy. And that has been described as a biological drive, much like hunger and thirst. It's a really uncomfortable feeling, but it's adaptive because it motivates us to meet those biological needs. So much like hunger motivates us to seek out food to meet those biological needs, that loneliness motivates us to connect socially to meet our biological social needs. And so it may be that our current relationship isn't meeting those needs, and we may need to look to other relationships, or it may be repairing that relationship so that it can meet those needs. But recognizing that may be signaling that your needs are not being met and that steps need to be taken.
I would just add to that too, that's a really interesting perspective. Because clearly I'd been thinking about it in terms of being, say, broken up with in a romantic or friendship relationship, but that perspective too of, when you are the person who needs to do the breaking up. And we've done some research in my lab, and this is specifically with Samantha Joel, who takes the perspective basically that we underestimate how pro-social people are, right? That I think oftentimes when we get into these conversations about what are our evolved needs in terms of our social relationships, we often think about it of like, what do we want to get from other people, right? But we've also evolved to be caring beings. We have a very active caregiving system that if we didn't, our children would be in a lot of trouble, right? And so, I often talk about like, why do we have cats? I mean, in a lot of ways, cats don't do anything for us, but we get inherently rewarded by taking care of other people. But in situations like this can get us in trouble, that we don't like hurting other people. So, some of the studies that we've done in my lab, we've looked at, for example, if you know that your romantic partner will get hurt when you break up with them, you're still more likely to stay with them, even if you personally are unhappy, right? We've done experimental studies where, we ask people, oh, what are 3 deal breakers you would have in a partner? And they give you your 3 deal breakers. And then you show them, oh, here's a person in another room who's interested in you. They just so happen to have all 3 of your deal breakers. And if we were completely homo economicus and just making economical decisions, we would just be like, oh, well, this person doesn't meet my needs. I will easily reject this person. And people often don't. And they really underestimate. They say in the abstract, I would completely reject this person. And when they're actually faced with the prospect of hurting people's feelings, they have a hard time doing it. And I think that that's problematic in terms of an individual who has a frenemy that they need to get rid of. But thank God as a society that we care about people this much, right? And I do think that that's something that often gets underestimated in these conversations, is that level of care that we have for people, even at our own detriment, is a glue that often helps keep society together.
And I'll just clarify, it's interesting because when I do this research on ambivalent relationships, um, the assumption is that because they're associated with mental outcomes, we should get rid of them. And we, first of all, we find that people still maintain them, but one of the things that a reviewer brought up, which as any academic can speak to, oftentimes, when we first get that reviewer, it's like, oh, you kind of want to get defensive or push back, but often they have really, really incredibly important insight that makes your work better. And I remember this reviewer um, uh, pointing out that, oftentimes in a relationship, there are two people contributing to that. And we assume that in that relationship it's the other person's fault. um, and in essence, might there be characteristics about people who have greater numbers of ambivalent relationships in their networks, that they may be less tolerant of other people's imperfections, that they may have less maturity, there may be less ability to manage imperfect people and imperfect relationships, and so I think it's important to recognize that part of that might be that there can be contributors on both sides of the interpersonal relationship, and recognizing how that may be contributing to that relationship, so that we can better understand how to improve people's relationships as well as their individual well-being.
Well, thank you both for bringing this back to a positive note so that we can end on a high note. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy that you came and joined us to share your work. And to our audience, we really hope you enjoyed hearing from our speakers about their work today. We'll be sending you a 1-minute survey after the broadcast. We really value your feedback, so let us know how we're doing, how you feel about our programming, and feel free to share topics you'd like for us to cover in the future. Email us at sscience@apa.org with your recommendations. Also, if you like what you saw today, join us on March 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern for our next science showcase on the magnetism of March Madness and a look at the psychology of sport fandom. The registration link will show up in the chat box shortly. For other content from our journals and for other hot topics in psychological science, we encourage you to subscribe to our Editor's Choice newsletter. So psychology research chosen by editors and authors that are doing so much hard work in psychological science can come hot off the presses into your inbox. Finally, please subscribe to Science Spotlight, your source for the most relevant news and information for psychological scientists by psychological scientists. Special thanks to our wonderful speakers. We deeply appreciate your time and support. A huge shout out to our production team for coordinating everything behind the scenes. And most of all, thanks to our viewers. We're here for you, and we hope to see you at our upcoming events. I'm Derek Snyder with Science Showcase, and I wish you a good day.